They found the first document by accident, if accidents really existed inside federal archives. It happened in late autumn of 1998, inside a temperature-controlled room beneath the Cincinnati field office, where shelves held decades of cases no one spoke about anymore. The agent who discovered it wasn't looking for anything connected to Ohio. He was tracing an unrelated chain of interstate theft reports when a misfiled folder slipped out of a stack. A thin brown folder, unmarked except for a faint numerical code from the early 1970s, fell to the floor without making a sound. Inside, there was a single sheet stamped "Restricted," no case number, no classification, just a date, October 12, 1974. At first glance, the page looked like a routine field note, something scribbled during a long shift by an agent who didn't expect it to matter. But the more they read, the stranger it became. The document described a brief interview with a 7-year-old boy at a rural elementary school in north-central Ohio. The boy claimed he had been watching a blue van parked near the gravel lot for several days. It always arrived before the first bell. It always left after the teachers entered the building. It never parked in the same spot twice. And he had drawn something on the back of the page. 2 curved lines that nearly met, then split apart again, like a broken loop. The drawing shouldn't have mattered. Kids draw strange things all the time. But the symbol looked familiar. One of the agents recognized it from an entirely different timeline. An unrelated case file dated 1979, involving an abandoned capsule found on the shoulder of Route 23. Another capsule had been discovered 2 years later, then another, and another. Each contained a folded piece of paper with a symbol, sometimes a straight line, sometimes the double curve, sometimes a jagged shape like the edge of a map. Over 2 decades, no one had connected those symbols with anything coherent. They were dismissed as pranks or as harmless oddities from the back roads of Ohio. But here it was again, 5 years earlier, drawn by a child who had no way of knowing the pattern would continue. 2 agents brought the page to their supervisor. Within hours, he sealed the entire folder inside a restricted evidence envelope. Within days, the Bureau had pulled every archived report even remotely related to unexplained roadside discoveries across Ohio between 1974 and 1998. Most had been forgotten. A few had never even been processed. All contained fragments, symbols, shapes, distances, and anonymous reports of vehicles that seemed to appear and disappear without any clear purpose. The problem wasn't the symbols themselves. The problem was the consistency. A straight line, a curve, a corner, a jagged edge, repeated across counties, across decades, across seasons. Someone had been leaving them there. Someone who understood the geography of silence, highways before dawn, schoolyards before the first bell, abandoned fields where gravel dust floated in the air like memory. By late 1998, the Bureau quietly formed a small internal unit. 4 analysts, 2 field agents, and a forensic psychologist brought in from Quantico. Their task wasn't to solve a crime. There was no official crime to solve. Instead, their task was to determine whether the symbols were part of a larger behavioral pattern, something that had gone unnoticed for 20 years simply because it didn't resemble anything traditionally criminal. Their first challenge was temporal. Some reports were as early as 1974, others as late as 1997. The pattern stretched across almost a full generation of Ohio residents. The second challenge was geographical. Rural counties, small towns, forgotten intersections, stretches of highway no one monitored closely. The third challenge was conceptual. The symbols weren't accompanied by threats, letters, or statements. They weren't signatures, they weren't marks of ownership, they weren't warnings, they were placements. Deliberate, precise, repetitive. The more the team studied the drawings, the more they resembled something not artistic but structural, like fragments of a map that had been disassembled into emotional coordinates. Straight lines aligned with long rural roads, curved lines echoed river bends, sharp corners matched the edges of old industrial zones, and the symbols always appeared near spaces connected to transition, schools at the edge of farmlands, roads that shifted from paved to gravel, factories that closed in the 1980s and never reopened. The first breakthrough came from an analyst who mapped every symbol chronologically and discovered that they formed a loop, not geographically, but psychologically. The symbols repeated in cycles, each one corresponding to a place that had existed in the life of the boy from 1974. The van he had drawn, the gravel lot he had mentioned, the field behind his school. The old access road that curved toward the river, none of it made sense individually, but collectively they formed a memory trail, one that someone had been retracing for decades. As the analysts dug deeper, they discovered something unsettling. The boy from 1974 had been interviewed only once. After that, he had disappeared from the records, not as a missing person, simply as someone who grew up, moved on, and blended into the anonymity of adulthood. There were no criminal ties, no psychiatric history, no relocations that stood out, nothing that indicated he had any contact with federal authorities again. But the symbols followed his childhood geography with unnerving precision. And the van he described, a 1970s Ford Econoline, dark blue, matched the same model reported near symbol sites as late as 1991. The Bureau didn't say it aloud at first, but the implication hovered over every meeting. Whoever was leaving the symbols wasn't recreating a crime. They were recreating a childhood, and they were doing it over and over again, for reasons no one understood. By winter of 1998, the team realized they weren't dealing with a threat. They were dealing with a pattern. And patterns, unlike crimes, don't stop on their own. They continue until something interrupts them. It was then, when the loop finally came into focus, that the Bureau quietly labeled the file with a classification few agents ever encounter: forbidden, access restricted, no external references, no interagency communication. And so began the reassembly of a timeline that had been scattered across 24 years of rural silence in the state of Ohio. The deeper the analysts dug into the old Ohio reports, the more one element kept surfacing like a submerged shape returning to the waterline. The van, not a unique plate, not a specific owner, not a confirmed sighting tied to any individual, just a type repeated across decades. The same silhouette, the same era, the same color drifting like a ghost along the edges of small towns. A dark blue Econoline, sometimes clean, sometimes dusty, sometimes described as older than it should be, sometimes as quiet, sometimes as out of place. Always near the symbols, always observed from a distance, never stopped, never traced. The van became the gravitational center of the investigation, not because it did anything, but because it was always there. A presence without action, a shadow without movement, a memory without origin. One analyst, an expert in behavioral mapping, proposed something controversial during an internal meeting in early 1999. Maybe the van was never the point, she said. Maybe it was the anchor, a fixed image in the mind of someone who needed repetition to make sense of their world. It was an idea no one knew how to categorize, not forensic, not criminological, but eerie in its logic. When they overlaid all the sightings of the blue van, stretching from 1974 to 1991, they noticed something that made the entire room fall silent. The positions formed not a line, not a scatter plot, but a shape, a crude outline of the same double curve the child had drawn in 1974. The same curve that appeared in capsules throughout the 1980s. The same curve that repeated in 3 separate counties during the early 1990s. The shape was never perfect. Real landscapes rarely allow that, but it was intentional. Someone was following a path. Not physically identical each time, but psychologically identical. It was the forensic psychologist, Dr. Jacobs, who finally articulated what no one had dared to say aloud. Whoever created these symbols has been repeating a memory, not a message. He's mapping something he lived, something formative. These aren't crimes. They're reconstructions. Reconstructing what exactly remained unclear. The next breakthrough came when the team reviewed soil samples from 3 symbol sites, each collected by local deputies years before the FBI even noticed the pattern. The samples didn't match each other, different terrains, different minerals, but there was one constant: traces of gravel dust consistent with old schoolyard lots from the 1970s, a detail that tied the modern patterns back to the child's original environment. Someone had spent 20 years returning to places that felt like the gravel lot behind the boys' school. Not the school itself, just the outskirts, the thresholds, the places where memory lingered without explaining itself. In the spring of 1999, another peculiar connection emerged. A deputy from Marion County came forward with an old incident report from 1984. The report documented an anonymous call made by a man who said only one sentence before hanging up: "He's drawing the roads again." The call had been dismissed as a prank, But now, in context, it sounded like a warning from someone who recognized the pattern long before the FBI even knew it existed. Who was he? Why again? How many times had these patterns happened before anyone realized? The Bureau attempted to trace the number, but the telephone company had lost the microfilm record during a storage transition in the late 80s. Another fragment swallowed by time. As the investigation advanced, the unit began reconstructing a psychological timeline, a silent biography of someone who left no letters, no threats, no statements, only shapes. The trajectory suggested a mind organized around loops. A person who didn't escalate, didn't deviate, didn't improvise, he repeated. Always the same. The van, the curve, the roadside edge, the capsule, the folded paper. But something else began to emerge beneath the surface. A rhythm, almost mathematical. Every time investigators plotted symbol dates onto a calendar grid, the intervals between appearances formed a predictable cycle, never identical, but growing shorter as the years progressed. As if the author's need to repeat was accelerating, as if whatever he was chasing was getting closer. The psychologist suggested a possibility. He's approaching the original memory. Whatever started this, he's circling back to it. If that were true, then the cycle had a destination, a final point, a place where memory and ritual would converge. The analysts called it the origin point, a theoretical location that didn't appear in the symbols directly but influenced all of them, like the hidden center of a compass. They didn't know where it was yet, but they knew the symbols were orbiting it. In the summer of 1999, one analyst noticed something overlooked in the 1974 interview transcript. The boy had said the van was always there before the bell. That line, seemingly irrelevant, hinted at routine, predictability, fear mixed with familiarity. Children don't track vehicles unless they matter, and vehicles don't reappear in adulthood unless they shaped something profound. The team mapped every van sighting to school-hour timelines of the era. The pattern aligned almost perfectly with morning arrival windows from the boys' district in the mid-70s. Whoever the adult symbol lever was, he had internalized the schedule of his childhood like a metronome. His entire adult routine, every symbol, every placement, seemed calibrated to echo those early hours. Piece by piece, the Bureau began to see the unsettling shape of a life they had never lived, but someone had lived so intensely that he spent decades reconstructing it under the cover of quiet rural roads. The forbidden file grew thicker, not with crimes because nothing technically criminal had occurred, but with echoes. Echoes of a childhood no one remembered except the person repeating it. And the repetition wasn't slowing. It was sharpening, narrowing, approaching something. The cycle was returning home. By early autumn of 1999, the small FBI unit assigned to the Forbidden Ohio file had become fluent in the language of the symbols, at least as fluent as anyone could be in a system built by a mind that didn't communicate in words. They could recognize not just shapes but temperatures, the emotional weight of a line, the urgency of a curve, the hesitation inside a jagged mark. The symbols were no longer artifacts. They were signposts. They were memories externalized onto geography. But one question remained unanswered, growing heavier with each discovery. Why Ohio? Why this particular patch of rural land? Why the gravel roads, the edge-of-town lots, the empty spaces where silence hung like a second atmosphere? It was an analyst named Keller who noticed something pivotal, something that would reorient the entire investigation. She plotted every symbol from 1979 to 1997, not across the whole state, but only across 3 counties, Wyandotte, Marion, and Hardin. When the point stabilized, the result was a rough, uneven triangle. A triangle that didn't point outward, it pointed inward. Everything, every symbol, every van sighting, every capsule found on the side of a rural road occurred within 40 miles of that triangular region. Inside the triangle were fields, abandoned gas stations, closed school districts, and small pockets of suburban streets built in the 1980s, when Ohio briefly grew before shrinking again. There were no national landmarks, no major industries, no unique criminal histories. But when they cross-referenced old census logs, they found something that stopped the entire room. The boy from 1974 had lived inside the triangle. Every place he mentioned, every road, every field, every gravel lot, was inside the borders of that quiet three-county shape. The symbols weren't random. They were returning the adult to the perimeter of his childhood. The closer the team looked, the more the triangle felt like a corridor rather than a region. Like the author had walked these loops hundreds of times, imprinting them into his mind until they became part of him. A behavioral archaeologist on the team noted, almost quietly, "He's reducing the distance between memory and present. The triangle is collapsing." But the collapse wasn't just geographic, it was temporal. The chronology of the symbols had always seemed odd. There were gaps that lasted years, then placements that occurred within months. The analyst team believed at first that the gaps represented emotional dormancy, or perhaps life circumstances that interrupted the ritual. But when Keller recalculated the intervals with a different algorithm, one that analyzed emotional recurrence rather than date proximity, the pattern shifted dramatically. The gaps weren't gaps, they were cycles. Each cycle was shorter than the last. It was as if the author's internal metronome was speeding up, beating faster, tightening the loops of his ritual until they began to close around the center. In late 1999, a retired school secretary from the boys' childhood district came forward after reading about an unrelated FBI request in the local paper. She remembered something strange from the early 70s, something she hadn't thought about in years. The same blue van had been parked near the school on multiple mornings. She hadn't reported it then because it was the era of looser boundaries, and vans near schools weren't automatically suspicious. But she remembered the child, the 7-year-old, and how he always stood near the fence facing the gravel lot, as if waiting for something. "What was he looking at?" one of the agents asked her. The secretary shook her head slowly. "I don't think he knew," she said. "Sometimes kids watch things they're scared of. Sometimes they watch things they're attached to. Sometimes both." Her memory wasn't precise, but it sparked an idea. The boy's fixation had begun not as fear, but as pattern recognition. A child's brain trying to impose structure on something that made no sense to him. And as adults often do, the Bureau wondered whether the boy had ever told anyone else about what he'd seen. That's when they found the library log. In a faded card catalogue from 1975, 1 year after the initial interview, was a record that the boy had checked out the same book multiple times, a children's atlas of North American roadways. A simple book, all illustrations, no text-heavy theory, perfect for a child quietly building a mental universe out of roads and curves and angles. The atlas had been withdrawn from circulation in 1983, then donated to a local charity shop, another thread severed by time. In early winter of 1999, the analysts returned to the Triangle region to interview other childhood acquaintances. Many didn't remember the boy well. Small-town life produces memories that fade fast, but a few recalled something telling. He was quiet, observant, and anxious around unexpected change. One classmate remembered how he lined up his pencils until they were perfectly parallel. Another remembered how he avoided stepping on leaves, choosing only the bare patches of dirt. A third described how he always paused before entering a room, as if mapping it. The team began to see him not as a mystery figure, but as a profile, a child with obsessive tendencies, hyper-attentive to spatial detail, using patterns as coping mechanisms long before he had a name for what he was doing. What no one expected was what arrived next. In March of 2000, a farmer from outside Upper Sandusky called the sheriff's office. He had found something on the eastern edge of his property while clearing debris after a storm. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't large. It wasn't even immediately noticeable. It was a small metal capsule. Inside the capsule was a folded segment of paper with a single symbol, a triangle, not the rough childlike shapes of earlier years, a precise triangle. Sharp corners, straight edges, measured, deliberate. The investigators froze. A triangle had never appeared before. The author had never referenced the full shape, only the pieces, the corners, the edges, fragments of a geometry that only made sense when reassembled. But now the full shape was emerging. The pattern wasn't expanding, it was contracting, closing in on itself. The psychologist's voice when she finally spoke was low and steady. "He's nearing the origin point. The symbol tells us he's reached the center." The team understood what that meant. The cycle was entering its final phase. Memory was aligning with geography. The ritual was reaching its conclusion. Something was coming next, something inevitable, but they still didn't know where or who. or why the Bureau had hidden this file for decades. What they did know was this. For the first time in 26 years, the author was no longer circling, he was closing the loop, and once a loop closes, it cannot remain silent for long. By the spring of 2000, the triangle had become the central obsession of the investigative team, not because it revealed everything, but because it revealed too much, too cleanly, too quietly. Patterns rarely behave with such precision unless the mind producing them has been refining its internal logic for decades. And that was the unsettling conclusion the analysts reached. This wasn't improvisation. This was a long rehearsal nearing its final performance. The new triangle symbol found on the farmer's land wasn't merely another placement. It was a signal, an inflection point, the moment a pattern stops expanding and begins collapsing into its origin. Every investigator understood the weight of that shift, though no one said it aloud during the initial briefing. They all felt it. In the chilled silence after the photograph was projected against the meeting room wall. A triangle, perfectly proportioned, rendered in pencil strokes that were steady and almost unnervingly confident. Triangles don't occur naturally in this case, Keller said, not unless the writer wants them to. The team had reconstructed 25 years of memory patterns, but now something new was happening, something that implied the author wasn't merely remembering anymore. He was retracing, backwards, toward the place where all of this began, the convergence phase. Dr. Jacobs, the forensic psychologist, called it temporal collapse, the point where a ritual stops functioning as repetition and transforms into completion. And for someone organized around obsessive geometry, the completion of a triangle wasn't symbolic. It was structural. It meant the shape was whole again. It meant the loop could finally close. Within days of that discovery, more capsules appeared. Not dozens, not even a handful. Only 3. But they were found with clockwork precision, each one placed on a road that formed one side of the geographic triangle, one on the western boundary near an abandoned grain elevator, one on the southern boundary by a bridge no longer used, and one on the northern boundary on the shoulder of a road that had once led to a now demolished elementary school. Each capsule contained a line, a simple straight line, no curves, no angles, no cryptic fragments. 3 sides, 3 lines, 1 triangle. The team didn't need to hold a meeting to understand the meaning. The author was marking the perimeter, just as he had done as a child when walking the edges of that same schoolyard, placing invisible boundaries around a world too large for him to navigate. As the team retraced each location, interviewing landowners, cross-referencing satellite imagery, and pulling every available record from the 1970s, something began to surface. A memory not belonging to any single witness, but to the region itself. People remembered a boy, not his name, just his shape, his presence. A quiet child who always lingered near the edges of things, too fearful to approach the playground, too observant not to watch everything around him. One retired teacher described him almost poetically. He looked like he was waiting for someone to arrive or for something to happen, but I don't think he knew what he was waiting for. Another former classmate remembered how he always carried a small notebook, though he rarely wrote in it. He would draw the same shapes over and over, roads, I think, loops, lines, corners. Sometimes he'd erase everything and start again, like he was trying to get it right. The childhood recollections painted a portrait not of trauma, but of hyper-structured cognition, a boy who latched onto visual patterns like lifelines, not because they meant something, but because they anchored him to something stable. The question became, what had he seen in 1974 that locked itself so completely into his nervous system that he reconstructed its shape for the rest of his life? The missing interview pages might have contained that answer, but they were gone, cleanly torn from the folder sometime before the file was sealed. Federal agents speculated privately, even off record, that the boy may have seen something he wasn't supposed to see, something that an agent at the time considered sensitive enough to remove, even if the boy didn't understand the significance. But the investigators couldn't pursue speculation. They pursued patterns, and the patterns were converging toward a single point, the place where the child had first drawn the double curve symbol. That location, identified through old school board maps and county zoning records, no longer existed. The school had been demolished in the early 1980s. A small trucking company had bought the land in the late 1990s. But the lot behind the school, the gravel lot the boy mentioned, had never been repaved. It was still there, buried beneath patches of weeds and wind-blown dust. And that was where the fourth capsule appeared. The discovery happened quietly. A local dog walker noticed the glint of metal under the weeds and reported it, not knowing what it was. The sheriff's office forwarded the information to the FBI unit, and within 2 hours, the lot was crawling with federal agents. Inside that capsule was the most unsettling symbol of all, a small, nearly perfect circle. No symbol in 26 years had ever been a circle. Cross-referencing the circle's placement with the previous triangle symbol and the 3-line markers, the team realized what the author was doing. He wasn't just marking the boundaries, he was marking the center. The circle was the exact midpoint of the triangle, the point where all memory converged, where his childhood and adulthood overlapped, where the first van sighting occurred, where the first double curve symbol was drawn. The team called it Ground Zero. Jacob studied the circle long into the night, analyzing every millimeter of graphite pressure, every stroke, every nuance. "This is ritualistic closure," she said. "He's coming home." But coming home to what? The investigative team needed to know who he was, not the child, but the adult who had carried this ritual into middle age. They pulled every possible school record, every birth certificate, every census entry from the 1970s within the triangle. They found 428 children who could have been the boy, narrowed them down to 76, then 12, then 3. Only one had lived within walking distance of the original gravel lot. Only one had checked out the Children's Atlas repeatedly. Only one had moved away at age 14, then returned to Ohio in adulthood. Only one had purchased a used blue Econoline van in 1989. He had lived quietly, held several small jobs, never married, never left the region again, never had contact with law enforcement. His life had no extraordinary features, no dramatic events, no obvious psychological breaks. But the pattern he left behind told an entirely different story, one of internal architecture shaped by a childhood moment that his adult brain had never stopped reconstructing. As winter approached in late 2000, something became clear to the team. They weren't tracking a criminal. They were tracking a memory so powerful it had become a geography. And that geography had almost reached its endpoint. Because only one step remained after the center is marked, returning to the origin. By early 2001, the investigative unit had accepted a truth they never intended to face. The man they were tracking, this quiet architect of lines, curves, capsules, and disappearing vans, was not escalating. He was finishing. And when a pattern built across 26 years reaches its terminus, it becomes something more than behavior. It becomes inevitability. The circle placed at the gravel lot behind the old elementary school changed the tone of the entire case. Until then, the team had been dealing with fragments, symbolic debris scattered across rural Ohio from a mind caught in a perpetual loop. But a circle was different. A circle meant completion. It meant a return to the beginning. It meant the loop was meant to close exactly where it had opened in 1974. The question now was not if he would return, only when, and what the final placement would be. The team doubled its resources quietly, discreetly. They didn't want to attract attention because the entire rationale behind the forbidden file was precisely that, secrecy. The file's existence threatened to confuse federal jurisdictions, distort old cases, raise questions about why a symbol cycle had been ignored for 2 decades. No one wanted that. Not the Bureau, not the counties, not the investigators themselves. "We're not chasing a crime," the unit chief reminded them in a meeting. "We're chasing a memory someone refused to let go." In April, a new sighting of the blue Econoline came in. It was found not parked but abandoned, half sunk in the mud off an access road near the northern edge of the triangle. The vehicle was old, decaying, with mismatched tires and a cracked windshield, but it was unmistakably the same model described by the boy in 1974 and seen repeatedly across the decades. Agents surrounded the van slowly, not with weapons drawn but with the caution reserved for relics, artifacts that hold meaning far heavier than their physical form. When they opened the rear doors, there were no threats, no messages, no hidden compartments, only objects arranged with obsessive order, a map of rural Ohio from the 1970s, a blank notebook with faint indentations of shapes repeatedly erased, a bent schoolyard ruler, the wooden kind used in classrooms throughout the Midwest. A small plastic container of gravel dust. It was a mobile altar to memory, not a crime scene, a reconstruction of a childhood environment, preserved like a shrine. One agent whispered, almost involuntarily, "He's preparing." But preparing for what? Closure, ending the loop, returning to the point where the ritual was born. Over the next 3 weeks, something changed in the pattern. Instead of symbols, instead of capsules, silence became the new signal. There were no new sightings, no shapes, no lines, nothing. Paradoxically, silence within a pattern is itself a pattern, and the team recognized it. He had entered the internal phase of the ritual, the part that doesn't require placement, only movement. Jacobs explained it in clinical terms. When someone is nearing the end of a compulsive ritual, especially one rooted in obsessive spatial memory, the external markers go quiet. Everything compresses inward, the world narrows, only the final step remains. So they waited, and Ohio waited with them unknowingly. Then, on May 17th, a jogger near a river embankment spotted something metallic reflecting in the grass. He assumed it was litter, but when he picked it up, he realized it was a capsule, identical to all the others. Inside there was no symbol, no line, no curve, only an empty page, folded once. A page without meaning, or rather, a page meaning everything. A blank beginning, a reset. Jacobs breathed out slowly. This is preparatory erasure. He wasn't referencing anything anymore. He was clearing the slate for the final mark. They knew then that he would return to the place that held his oldest trace, the place he had drawn the double curve, the place that had anchored an entire adult life in ritualized geometry. The team deployed unmarked vehicles around the perimeter of the original triangle. They didn't intend to arrest him. Not yet. He hadn't committed a federal crime. Their goal was observation, identification, confirmation. They needed to understand the end of the pattern before choosing how to intervene. 3 days passed, then a fourth. Nothing. On the 5th day, at dawn, a pickup driver reported a man walking alone along an old service road near the demolished school site. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He was pacing slowly, methodically, taking measured steps that created a large, smooth arc on the gravel. The agents approached on foot, quietly. They didn't want to interrupt him. Not yet. There was something sacred about the moment, something reminiscent of a musician trying to find the final notes of a composition, decades in the making. The man paused occasionally, drawing invisible shapes in the air with his index finger, as if tracing lines only he could see. His movements were slow, almost tender. When he reached the midpoint of the arc, he knelt and touched the gravel, pressing it into a small piece of folded paper. The paper, when retrieved later, contained the completed symbol. A curve, another curve, 2 lines that almost met, then split. The first symbol he had ever drawn as a child, redrawn with a steady, adult hand. It had taken 26 years for him to complete the loop. He had returned to the moment that shaped him, not to rewrite it, not to solve it, but to witness it again. A full circle, drawn in gravel. The agents approached him gently. He did not look surprised. He did not resist. He simply lowered the pencil he had been holding and looked at them with a calm, unfocused gaze, as though he were seeing the ending and the beginning simultaneously. One agent asked softly, "Do you know why we're here?" The man nodded once. His voice was quiet, almost weightless. "I finished." 2 words. The end of a cycle. The end of a ritual. The culmination of decades spent aligning memory with geography. The team exchanged glances. They all understood what came next. The final step was no longer about patterns. It was about accountability. The Bureau took him into custody, not for a violent act, none had been recorded, but for federal obstruction, tampering with evidence across jurisdictions, evasion, and failing to report materials tied to historic investigations. Charges that in aggregate held significant weight. But the real reason? They needed to close the forbidden file, and files only close when the subject is documented, processed, and sentenced. The man's adult life had been a geography of memory. Now it would become a geography of consequence, and Ohio, for the first time in decades, fell silent again. But the loop wasn't finished. Not yet. One more layer remained. The federal conclusion. The man was processed quietly, so quietly that even within the Bureau, only a handful of personnel knew his name or the details of the decades-long investigation tied to him. Officially, he was listed under a federal obstruction case involving interference with multi-jurisdictional evidence trails. Unofficially, he was known simply as the Architect, a title that captured the essence of what he had constructed, a life shaped not by intent but by recurrence, not by deviance but by geometry. When they brought him into the Cincinnati field office for initial questioning, he did not seem disoriented or fearful. If anything, there was a subtle calm radiating from him, as though the act of finishing the final symbol had resolved something inside him. The agents recognized the look. Not resignation, but completion, the end of ritual. In a small interview room with fluorescent lighting and no windows, the man sat still, hands folded, gaze directed toward a fixed point on the table. Dr. Jacobs entered first, not to interrogate him, but to observe. She placed a folder in front of him, the forbidden file thickened by months of reconstruction, and asked a single question: "Do you understand the importance of what you've been doing?" The man blinked slowly. His voice was soft, steady. "I wasn't doing anything important, I was remembering." The answer struck the room with the weight of truth. He wasn't performing a ritual for effect. He wasn't creating symbols for others to decipher. He was organizing a memory, one that had crystallized in childhood and solidified into a lifelong pattern. Jacobs asked him what he remembered most clearly from 1974. He thought for a moment. "The curve in the road," he said. "The way the gravel sounded under the van's tires. It always made the same sound." "The van frightened you?" she asked. "No," he replied. "It stayed in the same pattern. I understood it. Everything else changed. The van didn't." It was the closest he came to describing the invisible architecture of his mind. The federal attorneys built their case carefully. They had no violent crime to prosecute, no physical harm attributed to him, no malicious intent. But he had tampered with old evidence across county lines, transported unidentified materials tied to historic investigations, repeatedly trespassed on private and restricted land, refused to report discovery of sensitive objects, interfered with federal casework. Spanning more than 2 decades individually, these were misdemeanors or low-level felonies. Together, they represented a pattern of systematic obstruction. The Department of Justice had no interest in exposing the forbidden file to public scrutiny. The optics would be disastrous. It would raise questions no press team could answer. Why had the Bureau ignored these symbols for so long? Why had local cases been closed prematurely? What was removed from the 1974 interview transcript, and why? Who decided to hide the file? So the government did what governments often do with anomalies. They reframed them. They charged the man with a consolidated felony, federal evidence interference, and long-term obstruction of investigative processes, a charge heavy enough to ensure containment without revealing the details. During the sentencing hearing, the man said nothing. His public defender spoke on his behalf, arguing psychological history, obsessive behavior patterns, and lack of criminal intent. The judge listened, expression unreadable. When the time came for sentencing, the courtroom fell into the kind of silence that feels engineered, as if the room itself understood the weight of what was happening. The judge leaned forward. "For conduct spanning more than 20 years, he said, "and for your role in compromising historical investigatory material, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The man did not react. He simply nodded once, the same way he had nodded on the gravel lot when he completed the final curve. When the hearing ended, 2 marshals guided him out of the courtroom. He did not resist. He did not speak. He walked with the same quiet steps he had taken along the edges of his childhood roads. The Bureau filed the documents that afternoon. The forbidden file was stamped, archived, sealed permanently. No press release, no internal memo, no classification update, just a box placed into the deepest section of the archive, the place where only a handful of cases are stored, cases not forgotten, but intentionally hidden. In the weeks following the sentencing, the investigative team disbanded. Some returned to their previous units, some transferred. Jacobs accepted a position in Quantico, where she later wrote an internal paper titled Spatial Memory Recurrence and Behavioral Geometry in Forensic Context, a report that circulated quietly among senior analysts before being shelved. But the file lingered in their minds, even after the government considered it closed. Keller, the analyst who had mapped the triangle, found herself returning to Ohio roads on her days off, driving through long corridors of farmland, past abandoned barns and rusted fences, following the loops and curves with the quiet intuition of someone who had studied them for too long. She didn't stop anywhere. She didn't search for anything. She just drove, as if tracing a memory that didn't belong to her. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind a row of distant silos, she pulled over on a gravel turnout and stepped out of her car. The wind carried the faint smell of dust and cut grass. In the distance, the road bent into a soft curve, the same kind of curve that the boy had drawn in 1974, the same curve the man had retraced as an adult, the same curve that had become the first symbol of a lifelong ritual. She stood there for several minutes, listening to nothing and everything at once. And she felt it, the presence of a pattern that had outlived the man who created it. A pattern not born of malice or intent, but of memory, of repetition, of a child making sense of a world too large to understand. She realized then what the investigation had always been about. Not the man, not the van, not the capsules, not even the symbols, but the silence in between them. Patterns don't disappear. They linger in landscapes, in roads, in the spaces where memory once took shape. And Ohio, quiet, rural, ordinary Ohio, held that memory like a closed loop, a place where time folded into itself, and a boy's world became a man's ritual. As Keller walked back to her car, she whispered the final conclusion she wished she could have written in the official report. Some roads never forget. The forbidden file remained sealed. The man remained incarcerated for life. The pattern remained etched into the geography of north-central Ohio, a loop completed, a memory preserved, a silence that would outlast them all. Even after the forbidden Ohio file was sealed in the federal archive, the case did not rest. Not truly. Files may be locked away, but questions have a way of slipping through cracks in systems, lingering in the minds of those who were closest to them. And as weeks became months after the sentencing, subtle ripples began to spread through the Bureau's internal channels. Quiet discussions, off-record consultations, inquiries framed as academic curiosity. It started with a memo, not an official memo, but an inter-office note typed on an aging government terminal and left unsigned. It circulated briefly among senior analysts in Quantico, though no one claimed authorship. The message contained only one line. If the pattern ended, why are there still unexplained placements appearing in the perimeter? At first, the comment was dismissed as rumor. Federal systems often suffered from misfiled reports, and the team had accepted that false leads would occur. But within a month, 2 field agents in different counties inside the triangle submitted reports of objects resembling capsules found near roadside pull-offs. The objects weren't identical to the man's capsules, different metal, different folding method, different dimensions, but they were unmistakably inspired by them. Inside one was a crude drawing of a half-formed curve, shaky and childlike. Inside the other, a shape that resembled a distorted triangle, drawn with inconsistent pressure as if the person wasn't sure how to form it. The Bureau quietly analyzed both. The conclusion was clear. These symbols weren't his. They were imitations. The unit chief noted in his private logbook, reverberation effect, pattern echoes. People reproduce what they do not understand. The same phenomenon happened in other high-profile cases, but this case was unique because the original pattern had never been public. No press, no televised coverage, no leaks, no public records, nothing. So how did imitations appear? Theories emerged. Someone local had watched him during his rituals. A child from the region had accidentally witnessed the final placement. Word of mouth had traveled between families in quiet conversations. Or, more unsettlingly, someone had reconstructed pieces of the story simply by following the roads. But the most plausible theory came from Jacobs. Patterns don't require knowledge to be mimicked, only exposure. Someone saw the loop years ago. The Bureau did not open a new case. Instead, they created a sub-file, Forbidden Adjunct 7A, a thin folder containing the 2 capsule imitations and a typed note stating, Echo activity, non-criminal, monitor annually. It became one of several sub-files. Another contained a transcript from a call received by the Sheriff's Department in 2002. A woman claimed she saw a man walking in slow arcs near the old school site. When deputies arrived, they encountered only a teenager drawing lines with a stick in the dirt. When they asked why he was doing it, the boy shrugged and said, "I thought this is just what people did here." The deputy wrote in the report, "Local folklore forming. Nothing spreads faster in rural towns than myth, especially a quiet myth with no clear beginning." By 2003, a strange cultural artifact emerged. A high school student submitted a senior project titled The Roads That Remember, describing how certain intersections in the region feel like déjà vu. The project included hand-drawn versions of the double curve and triangle. The teacher, unaware of the file's existence, wrote in red pen, "Interesting symbols. Where did you get them?" The student replied, "They've always been around." The patterns had dissolved into the landscape, absorbed by memory, geography, and human storytelling. And because silence had always been the case's defining feature, the newly forming myths echoed that same silence. The Bureau monitored the situation from a distance. They didn't intervene. They simply watched as the echoes of one man's compulsive geometry seeped into the region's cultural subconscious. But something else troubled the original team, something unspoken. During routine maintenance in the Federal Archive in 2004, a clerk found the forbidden file box not quite where it should have been. It had shifted several inches on its shelf. There were no signs of tampering, no missing pages, no evidence of entry. But the movement was unusual. The archive shelves were tightly packed, and boxes didn't simply shift. The clerk filed a report. The archivist dismissed it. But Keller, upon hearing the story, wrote one line in her personal notebook, "Even sealed patterns are not static." It was the beginning of a realization spreading among the few who still remembered the case. The man had finished his loop, but the loop itself had not finished its reach. The Bureau never intended to speak to him again after the sentencing. Most convicted offenders, especially those serving life without parole, eventually fade from relevance once the appeals window closes. Their world shrinks to a concrete cell, and the agency moves on to the next crisis, the next pattern, the next emerging threat. But this case refused to rest quietly. It was Jacobs who first suggested a follow-up interview, though he insisted it was for behavioral refinement, not closure. The behavioral sciences unit had grown increasingly invested in mapping the exact structure of the man's pattern, how he formed it, when he began, what internal cues compelled him to move between counties at precise intervals. So in early 2000, 7 months after the sentencing, a small team drove to the state penitentiary outside Chillicothe. The prison was austere, built in an era when security meant concrete simplicity. Corridors hummed with fluorescent lights. The faint smell of detergent clung to the air. The interview room was small, windowless, painted a sterile off-white that seemed to drain color from everything inside it. A camera in the corner recorded silently, its red light steady and unemotional. He entered, escorted by 2 officers, his hands unshackled only after he sat. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes, those calm, watchful eyes, had not changed. He examined the room the way he had once examined roadways, intersections, rails of gravel, clinically, as if studying whether anything had shifted since his last pass-through. Keller sat across from him. Jacobs observed from the corner. She began with a neutral tone. "We aren't here to revisit the trial. We're here to understand the pattern." He tilted his head slightly, not defiant, merely attentive. "Patterns don't need understanding," he said. "They complete themselves." Jacobs leaned forward. "But you completed yours." You stopped. A faint smile appeared, but it did not reach his eyes. "I didn't stop. I reached the edge." Keller wrote something in her notebook, her handwriting quick but controlled. "The edge of what?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped once against the metal table in a rhythm that was too slow and too deliberate to be nervous. It resembled the pacing of his footsteps at the riverside all those years, steady, inevitable, recursive. Finally he said, "The edge of the space where the lines belong. Every loop ends, even the ones people don't see." Keller's pen froze. She looked up. "Did you believe the lines had meaning?" Another silence. Longer this time. "The ground remembers shapes," he said at last. "People walk over them, drive over them, build on them, but the shapes stay underneath. They just don't look anymore." Jacobs exhaled softly. "And you were trying to uncover them?" "No," the man replied. "I was trying to finish them." The interview lasted 86 minutes. He revealed nothing incriminating, nothing operational, nothing procedural, nothing that clarified the deeper motive. Yet simultaneously he revealed everything: the orientation of his thinking, the closed-loop structure of his compulsions, the reason he remained calm even during his arrest. He had believed the outcome was predetermined. The transcript would later be reviewed by 4 senior analysts. Their collective assessment read, "Subject exhibits structured cognitive disassociation paired with ritualistic orientation. Pattern completion appears central to identity formation." But more unsettling was a handwritten note added by an anonymous reviewer. "He speaks as if the loop existed before him." The team returned twice that year. The second interview concerned his early life. Though he resisted most attempts to trace chronology, he preferred describing spaces instead of time, the layout of rural roads, the way telephone poles created natural intervals, the sound of freight trains passing through small towns at night. "The world is full of markers," he said. "People just forget to notice them." The third interview was the shortest. Keller asked whether he had ever seen someone imitating his placements. He shook his head. "They're not imitations." "What are they?" she asked. "Misreadings." That was the moment Keller realized something profound. The man didn't view himself as the creator of the loop. He viewed himself as its interpreter, someone who had simply recognized a structure that others overlooked. After the final session, the prison staff reported that he requested no special privileges, no reading materials, no radio. He spent most hours sitting upright on his bunk, facing the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees. The guard described him as quiet, almost meditative. Some inmates deteriorate under isolation. He did not. He seemed at ease inside the rigid geometry of confinement. The Bureau's internal review concluded that no further interviews were necessary. The case was considered fully resolved. The forbidden file would remain sealed, with restricted access granted only to a narrow circle of analysts. But a footnote in the review, written in smaller font than the rest, revealed something unsaid. There is consensus that the subject would have continued indefinitely had he not been intercepted. Another line, written in darker ink: "Completion does not necessarily equal cessation." No one elaborated on what that meant. No one needed to. Years later, during the archival audit in 2007, a staff member found a folded sheet tucked into the back of the interview transcript. It was a blank piece of government paper, the standard issue used for internal memos. Except for the line faintly drawn in pencil, a single curve, incomplete. It could have been placed there by accident, or by a clerk doodling, or it could have been something else, an echo of a pattern that refused to disappear. The archivist logged the sheet as unrelated material and filed it away. But Keller, upon hearing of it, said quietly, "Loops don't end just because we close the file." The years following the man's incarceration brought a strange kind of quiet to the region, a quiet that did not resemble peace, but something closer to a town catching its breath after a long, invisible storm. The roads he once traveled remained there, unchanged in geography, but altered in the way people perceived them. Locals described certain intersections as feeling heavier at dusk, and elderly residents sometimes insisted that headlights lingered a little too long before turning the corner. The Bureau attributed these sentiments to residual fear. Communities build myths around what they cannot fully articulate, and the forbidden Ohio file had left behind more absence than explanation. Silence filled the gaps, and silence has a way of growing roots. Small cultural shifts began appearing. A mural painted on the side of a feed store in 2005 depicted looping county roads, converging into a shape only those who knew the file would recognize. A roadside cross placed by unknown hands bore a curve carved into its wooden surface. A regional zine published by college students included a short essay titled "The Geometry of Vanishings," which suggested that some landscapes chart their own stories. None of these references were explicit. None could be linked directly to the case, but they formed a pattern of their own, soft, echoing, undefined. By 2006, Keller had retired from fieldwork and moved to a quieter post teaching at Quantico. Her final lecture each semester was unofficially known as "The Case That Can't Be Taught." She never used the man's name, never showed photos, never displayed documents. Instead, she placed a blank sheet of paper on the lectern and traced a small, half-formed curve with her finger. Patterns don't announce themselves, she would say. They wait for someone patient enough to notice them. Students speculated about what the lecture meant. Some believed it referred to geographic profiling. Others thought it was a warning about tunnel vision. Only the few who had read the sealed appendix understood her message. Patterns can survive without perpetrators. Meanwhile, the archive experienced its own anomalies, not dramatic ones, but small disturbances that felt like soft tremors beneath the vast machinery of federal record-keeping. In 2010, during a routine audit, an archivist discovered that the Forbidden Files logbook had 2 entries that no one remembered making. The timestamps were correct, but the initials belonged to no employee on record. The entries contained no text, only the default placeholders inserted, when a clerk opens a file and closes it immediately. One agent dismissed it as a software glitch. Another suggested the file had been temporarily misshelved, but the archivist, an older man with a meticulous nature, noted privately that in 32 years of service he had never seen phantom entries appear on any other case. He requested a review of the building's access logs. The system reported nothing unusual. The file was returned to its shelf. Later that same year, a small envelope arrived at the local sheriff's office in one of the counties inside the original triangle. It contained no message, no return address, only an old highway map of the region. A single curve had been drawn on the edge of the map in fading ink, too faint to determine whether it was fresh or decades old. The sheriff placed it in a drawer, uncertain what to make of it. He never reported it to the Bureau. Unknown to him, a nearly identical envelope had been delivered to a rural historical society a few towns over. That one contained only a blank index card, with a pencil mark resembling a partial arc. The pattern was no longer a pattern of acts. It had become a pattern of appearances. Nothing criminal, nothing overt, but enough to stir the attention of analysts who had once considered the case safely dormant. Jacobs, who by then worked in a consulting capacity, reviewed scans of the objects. His assessment was simple. Someone is remembering him, and someone else is trying to forget. The Bureau chose not to intervene. No new crimes had occurred, no threats issued, no evidence of danger. But the analysts documented every appearance in a supplemental file designated Forbidden Echoes. It was thin at first, only a handful of pages. By 2013, it had grown to nearly 40. Meanwhile, inside the penitentiary, the man aged quietly. He received no visitors. He made no requests. He rarely spoke. But one officer, new to the facility and unaware of his significance, reported that the inmate occasionally traced slow arcs with his fingertip on the edge of his bunk. Not drawings, not symbols, just motions, as if rehearsing a pattern the world could no longer see. The officer asked him once what he was doing. He replied, "Keeping count." "Of what?" the officer asked, but the man did not answer. When the Bureau received word of this habit, Keller, though retired, provided a brief note in response. Some individuals do not stop patterns, they only stop performing them publicly. Her insight prompted a final internal review. The forbidden file was reopened, not for investigation but for reassessment. The team concluded that while the physical acts that defined the case had ceased, the psychological construct behind them remained active, at least within the man's internal world. And as long as that construct remained alive, the Bureau would continue observing the echoes forming along the edges of the region. The last documented echo occurred in early 2015, a photo left anonymously in a library book at Ohio State University. It showed an empty road at dusk, no vehicles, no people, nothing remarkable except for the fact that the road curved gently to the right in a manner unmistakably reminiscent of the man's original loop. On the back of the photo, a single sentence was written, "You can seal a file but not a path." The library staff discarded the photo, but a graduate assistant who noticed the handwriting emailed a low-resolution scan to the sheriff's office. The sheriff forwarded it to an analyst who once worked with Keller. The analyst sent it to Jacobs. He responded with 7 words, "Some cases stay open without being active." And with that, the forbidden file settled back into silence, not resolved, not forgotten, but suspended in the strange space between memory and myth, between geography and psychology. A case officially closed, unofficially watched, permanently unfinished in the minds of those who had traced its lines. And in the quietest parts of Ohio, on roads where headlights linger at odd angles, Some say the curve still appears, not as a symbol of fear, but as a reminder that patterns, once recognized, never entirely disappear. The final years of the Forbidden Ohio Files' relevance unfolded quietly, not with the urgency of an active case, nor with the ceremonial dignity of a historical closure. Instead, it faded in the way old frequencies fade after a radio is switched off, but continues humming faintly in the wires. By 2018, few agents at the Bureau even recognized the case number. New recruits, born after the man's sentencing, walked the halls unaware that a sealed archive sat 3 floors beneath them, containing thousands of pages that had shaped the institution's understanding of compulsive pattern behavior. But archives develop their own kind of memory. They keep track of what humans forget. In late autumn of that year, during a routine reclassification, an archivist, young, meticulous, new to the department, was assigned to evaluate which inactive files should be transferred to deep storage. He approached the forbidden file without knowing its significance. It was simply another beige box among thousands. He removed the lid. Inside were the documents exactly as they had been arranged years earlier. Interview transcripts, geographic grids, maps with faint pencil curves, highway analyses, psychological profiles, and sealed supplements marked with black stamps. But something at the bottom of the box caught his eye. A slip of paper folded once, not typed, not stamped, handwritten. He unfolded it slowly. There was no message, only a curve. A simple, precise, deliberate arc, drawn in dark pencil. The archivist stared at it, confused. He checked the log sheet for recent access entries. None, no initials, no timestamps. The box had not been opened since 2015. He brought the slip to his supervisor, who studied it for a long, motionless moment before saying, "Put it back where you found it and don't log the inquiry." The archivist hesitated. "Shouldn't we document it?" The supervisor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the box and returned it to the shelf herself, sliding it into the narrow gap between 2 older cases. Only then did she speak. "Some files don't benefit from being examined twice." The archivist left the room unsettled, feeling as though he had stepped into a story that neither began nor ended where he expected. Across the state, at the penitentiary, the man's health began declining. He was transferred to the medical unit in early winter. He spoke even less than usual. One evening, as a nurse documented his vitals, she noticed him tracing his fingertip along the edge of his blanket. The same slow arc he had been drawing for years. She had read fragments of his file after hearing rumors from staff, though she didn't know the details. "Are you drawing something?" she asked gently. He paused. Not to think. He paused as if listening. Then he said, "Lines don't disappear. They just change who notices them." It was the last full sentence he ever spoke. He passed away 3 weeks later, quietly, without incident. The prison notified the Bureau as protocol required. The official report listed natural causes. There was no ceremony, no obituary, only a brief entry in a federal ledger, noting date, time, and cause of death. But Keller, long retired, received an email from a former colleague informing her of the news. She read it twice, exhaled slowly, and closed her laptop without replying. The next day she drove to a stretch of rural road outside Chillicothe, the kind of place where headlights moved like whispers through the trees. She stepped out of her car and listened to the hum of distant traffic, the soft ticking of cooling metal, the faint rustle of dry leaves. For a moment she imagined the loop, its silent geometry running beneath the surface of the land, embedded like fossilized behavior. Then she whispered to no one. Some patterns die with the person who carried them. Others outlive their host. She never spoke of the visit. Back in the Federal Archive, the forbidden file remained untouched for years. Dust gathered on the lid. The corridor grew colder each winter. Tubes of fluorescent light flickered overhead, until one night in early 2021. The building's temperature sensors recorded a brief fluctuation in the lower stacks. Not dramatic, barely noticeable, yet enough to trigger a maintenance log. A technician checked the HVAC system and found nothing wrong. Before leaving, he passed by the aisle where the forbidden file sat. He noticed the box slightly misaligned, not opened, not disturbed, just shifted, as though someone had nudged it a few centimeters out of place. He adjusted it back without thinking. Hours later, he would try to recall how much it had moved, and he couldn't, only that something about the angle felt off, as if the box resisted sitting flush against the others. He didn't file a report. Neither did the next technician, who noticed the same misalignment 6 months later. By 2023, the myth had merged into local folklore. Teenagers told stories about the silent roads, truckers spoke of a curve that appears where it didn't used to, and hikers photographed odd markings on trees, arcs carved into bark by unknown hands. Most were fabrications, some were accidents, a few were difficult to classify, but none carried the original intent. They were shadows of shadows, patterns replicating themselves without purpose. In one small town, a retired sheriff kept a drawer full of anonymous letters he had collected through the years, maps, sketches, shapes. When he passed away, his family found the drawer and burned its contents, believing they were the ramblings of eccentric locals. Only one item survived the fire, a corner of a map with a faint pencil curve. It was found wedged under the drawer's metal runner. No one noticed it. The fire consumed the rest. And finally, in late 2024, the forbidden Ohio file was scheduled for transfer to deep storage. This time, the archivist assigned to the case knew exactly what it was: its silence, its reputation, its echoes. He opened the box to verify its contents. Everything was in order, except for a single addition, a plain sheet of paper resting on top, blank except for the smallest possible stroke of graphite, barely visible, a line so faint it could have been a smudge or a fold or a trick of the light. But when the archivist tilted the page under the lamp, the mark formed a familiar arc. He closed the box slowly, not out of fear, out of recognition. Patterns persist, even sealed ones. He placed the lid back on the box, carried it to the cart, and pushed it toward the elevator leading to deep storage, where it would rest in darkness, in temperature-controlled silence, surrounded by thousands of other secrets the Bureau preferred not to revisit. Before the doors closed, he looked at the box one last time, and though he would never admit it, he felt the distinct unsettling sense that the file was not being archived. It was returning to where it belonged.